All right, well, welcome everyone. I know we got a few people joining us as we're getting started here, so it usually takes a few minutes to make opening comments anyways. My name is Jim Jansen, and we also have Alan Benalik joining us today. Today's presentation is part of our, this would be the third land management quarterly of 2023. So we appreciate for everyone joining us here today. And as you can see that photo out there, we got that growing corn or soybeans. So hopefully everyone's crops are doing well. If you have any type of cropland in the state of Nebraska or even grazing land. I am Jim Jansen, and my contact information is found on the left. And we also have Alan Benalik joining us today. Alan is an extension educator emeritus from the University of Nebraska, and he's agreed to help us out on today's presentation as part of our transition to the next individual to replace him. But we're very gracious to have him join us. Alan, would you like to make a few comments?
Not too much, Jim. Thanks for having me on. Glad to help out. And I am officially retired, but you can still watch see some of my articles and see some of my videos at that website below my name.
Yep. All of Alan's presentations and publications are still up on the CAP website. It's at cap.unl.edu/succession. And the farm real estate information we'll be talking about today is cap.unl.edu/real estate. Yeah, if questions as we're going along, please type them into the question pane. Today's presentation is also being recorded. Today's recording, in addition to a PDF of the slides, will be posted on the CAP website. And I believe Ryan Evans, our media specialist here at the University of Nebraska that's helping host this today, will also be sending out a reminder within the next day or two when all the information is compiled. One of the things, Next Ag Appraisal and Realty. This is headed up by Ethan Sorensen, and his contact information is provided in the lower right-hand corner. Ethan is an independent certified general ag appraiser, works mainly in eastern Nebraska, northeast Kansas, parts of Missouri, as well as Iowa, and he's independent. So we really appreciate his sponsorship today, and if you have any questions or need anything, be aware that he is an independent appraiser. So if you need something of that nature, please reach out to him. Well, overview on what we're going to be covering today. We'll be highlighting some of the top things that we found out as part of the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey and Market Report. Those will include some brief comments on Nebraska land values, in addition to cash rental rates. We'll review what we call the special feature section on flexible cropland lease arrangements. And also, I need to update this slide here. We're actually going to be covering the special feature on adjusting irrigated cash rents when the tenant provides the irrigation equipment. Alan Benalik will be taking the second lead today, talking about good proper lease communication and giving a general reminder on verbal leases. It won't be too soon until September comes, and if you want to make any adjustments to your verbal lease, please be sure to take a look at that. And then finally, we had a couple questions submitted, and we're going to be going ahead and reviewing those with everyone today. So if you have any other questions or anything else, please type it into the Q&A pane, and we'll be sure to review those as time permits. So the first piece, we're going to take a look at the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey and Report, and I will be taking the lead on this. So the first thing, when it comes to Nebraska Farm Real Estate information, many folks are always interested on the annual updates. Here at the University of Nebraska, we do two different things. The first thing we do what is called the preliminary results. Those are published typically in the middle of March, and then the final report is published in June. With the preliminary results, they take a snapshot at the current state of land values in addition to cash rental rates. And the final report has all the preliminary information in addition to the special features section, an update to our historic series on land values or cash rents, in addition to extensive information on real estate transactions, who's buying, who's selling, how are the transactions being financed, things of that nature. Okay. And if you'd like to find the real estate information, please take a look at the cap.unl.edu website /real estate. If you're having a hard time finding that information on the website, reach out to one of your local extension offices here in the state. They usually can print off a few pages and send it to you, or you could stop by and visit them. Or another good resource, stop by your local public library, and for a nominal fee, I mean, $1 or $2, you can print off a whole bunch of pages of the report. Most people usually print off the first 10 to 12 pages, and with that, that can satisfy it that way. And the third option is you can contact Janine Anderson here at the University of Nebraska in the Department of Agricultural Economics, and she can send out our printed copy in color if you would like that as well. So there are several different ways you can find updates to this information. Just want to review this slide before. I'm sure many folks that are joining us today have seen this. Our information is sorted according to what we call the Nebraska Agricultural Statistic Districts. The agricultural statistic districts are the same thing as what we call the crop reporting districts. And with the crop reporting districts, we take the 93 counties in Nebraska, the 45 million acres of land, and we subdivide it into the 8 different regions. These 8 different regions have similar production attributes, things like similar expectations for rainfall, crop yield, soil type. Obviously, here in any of these districts across the state, there is a fair amount of variability between them, but nonetheless, they do give an indication on the basics on what we typically expect in the Northwest versus, say, the East, for example. A few comments on the farm real estate values. Keeping in mind, when we talk about the market value of something, the market value is like a snapshot in time. What was that land worth the day it was at the public auction, when the land went up for sale, or when somebody met someone else and they agreed to a set aside price for the parcel of property? The market value of land that the University of Nebraska reports on is the estimated market value as of February 1 of the current year. So an example, the blue line right here is the historic value of land. They estimated the market value of land as of February 1, 2024, compared to February 1st, 2022, and then compared to 2021. You'll notice here that the market value of land has increased significantly. Year over year, we're up about 14% during this period. And I believe it was 16% during this period, for an overall increase of about 30%. So anytime we see these large changes, you kind of wonder what's occurring or what's happening. And the last time we've seen some of these things was about a decade ago, back during the 2012 drought, the first time that the commodity prices took off, similar to in scope to what we've seen here recently. And keeping in mind, when we talk about what the cash rents might be for a parcel of land, whether it's grazing land, cropland, whatever the crop might be, or the type of livestock you might have, you got to keep in mind the value of that crop that's out there. In this slide right here, you'll see the value of marketing your average price of corn here in red. And obviously prices have trailed down lower since many of the leases that were signed here in late February or even early March of this past year. So just be aware that the value of what we have, the blue line, is tied to the value of what we're doing on that property. Cropland, it'll be interesting to see where the market value of land goes here in the next year. Related to the market value of land, I would say keep your eyes out on 2 things: the profitability of farming, so the prices of crops, livestock, input expenses. The other thing to keep an eye on what is occurring with the interest rates. The cost of borrowing has an inverse relationship between the value of an asset and the cost of financing. What I mean by that is over time, and this just doesn't happen overnight, but over time, as the interest rates increase, we tend to see a dragging down or a lowering effect, or at least we don't see a lot of these things where these things continually increase over time. We tend to see a gradual wane on the market by rising interest rates. Okay, all right. So what we're going to do here is just briefly review some of the regional estimates for 2023. I know many folks are starting to think about 2024 already. I would encourage you to look at the 2023 rates and think of it as a way to maybe benchmark where a lease has been. And what I mean by benchmark is you sometimes take a look back at where things have been to gain a better understanding on where they might be headed in the future. So here we have the 2023 dryland cropland rental rates. And this was the overall average across the state of Nebraska. I know many folks that are joining us today represent diverse land holdings where they might live in Omaha, but maybe they got some ground out in Cheyenne County or somewhere. What influences cropland cash rental rates? Many different things influence them, some that we're well aware of already if you're on the call. Quality of the land, type of soil, rainfall expectation, market competitiveness of the area. How do you have a lot of farmers? Are they very aggressive? Expectations. All these different things influence the cash rental rates. And in addition to the overall market average, we have what is called HAL here. And I'll move your attention to the lower bottom left-hand corner of the slide here. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, overall average, and average of the low grade. The high grade and low grade, what those represent, the people that take the survey, we ask them, what do you estimate the upper third of cash rent is? What do you estimate the lower third of cash rent is? And what do you estimate the overall average is? And some of those things I just mentioned related to the quality of land, market competitiveness, rainfall expectations, commodity prices, all those things influence some of the cash rental rates we see here and some of the differences by region on how cash rental rates can vary quite a bit in just one region, yet alone within one state. We go from the upper third average in Northeast Nebraska at 315 down to the low third average at 28. Obviously, there's a lot of differences in the type of land, rainfall, soil type, all these different things. Okay, I'm going to switch here. I'm not covering them today just for the sake of trying to stay on time today. We want to keep everything at or under an hour to respect everyone's time. The University of Nebraska also reports, in addition to center pivot irrigated cropland rental rates, they also report on gravity irrigated rental rates. Related to the gravity irrigated rental rates, they tend to rent for around $30 to $50, anywhere from $20, $30, $40, $50 an acre less than what the center pivot does. Obviously, the biggest difference being you don't have a pivot that you don't have to maintain or insure or be aware of. So that's why we see some of the differences in between gravity versus center pivot rates. And in addition to these averages, the University of Nebraska assumes with their survey that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. So we're talking the pivot, the pump, and the power unit, the three Ps. If the tenant provides one of those components, you may discount or deduct from the market prevailing cash rent to account for the fact that the landlord, they don't own the pivot, they don't have to insure it, they don't have to pay the tax or upkeep or these things if the tenant's the one providing it. So be sure to be aware of that when you're negotiating the cash leases. And the breakdown that we see here on cash rental rates for 2023, we have a pretty good range across Nebraska, and all the different factors I mentioned related to the productivity of the cropland definitely influence the cash rents. The other tip I'll put out there when it comes to negotiating leases, there's varying degrees of drought across Nebraska. Some areas are getting rain, some areas are quite dry. Hopefully everyone's picked up at least some rain at some point this summer. But the water policies that dictate how much water we can use for things like irrigation definitely have impacted some. Where if you're renting the cash rent, you're renting a parcel of ground for a certain rate, the land operator would typically assume that there's going to be a certain amount of water allocated. If there would be a situation where the water allocation is going to be cut, and say it's cut mid-season during irrigation, not before when the lease is signed. When the lease is signed, if you say there's going to be short water allocation, maybe you can negotiate that in. But if that's not the case, you would want to negotiate a provision in the lease to account for that. And I'm not exactly sure how to adjust that cash rent or how to adjust that lease, but we want to have a provision in there to account for uncertainty. One of the biggest uncertainties we have is sometimes water allocation during irrigation seasons when there is extensive drought across Nebraska. So that'd be a good provision to revisit if that's something that hasn't been addressed this year. And if you are in an area where you anticipate there might be another drought year the upcoming year. Now, when it comes to grazing land, there are different ways to rent land. Talk about the animal unit, the cow-calf pair, the per acre, per day, per season, per month. Probably 10 different ways. I know some people are very set on the per acre, some are very set on the per animal unit or per pair. The University of Nebraska reports on a per acre in addition to a per acre basis. So this is one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. So take, for example, here in the Southwest District, the low third average is 50.45. Let's just say it was $50 a month per pair. If you take 50 times 5, which is traditionally the 5-month grazing season, 50 times 5 would be about 250. If you're doing off-season grazing, say in the ranching areas of the state, off-season might be grazing of a sub-irrigated meadow after it was cut for hay once, or maybe calving cows out at a site and doing early spring grazing. If you're someone doing something like that, you might adjust these cash rents to account for the quality of the forages that are present during that grazing period and to account for some of these different factors. What I tell people when it comes to grazing land, be sure to negotiate a rate that's going to be appropriate for the property. And also, what is somebody willing to accept for payment? What is someone willing to write that check out for that use of that property? I don't care how the property is rented, but we need to set up a lease that makes sense for the property, given the carrying capacity, how many cow-calf, how many head of livestock you can put out on that site. And we failed to mention this on the irrigation, but especially on grazing land, there's definitely upkeep when it comes to fencing, control of noxious weeds and these things. We always get the question, at least once a week, somebody asks, who's responsible for maintaining the irrigation system or the fences or the weed control on grazing land? Alan and I always joke, it's always the other party, right? It's always someone else. Well, if you want to rent a property that has these agricultural improvements, something that's asphyxiated to the ground, if you're running a property like that, renting a property like that, the tenant wants to rent a property that's in good shape. If these things are already in good shape when they get there, the likelihood of them maybe being willing to maintain them might be a little bit higher than if you're renting a property that has a mile of fence that's basically shot and needs to be pulled out and replaced. Fencing expenses, if you're going to replace a 1/4 mile of fence and you're digging all these posts and string these new wires out, that is always a landlord expense. If a tenant provides one of those components, you might discount the rent to account for that. You might discount the rent if they're willing to upgrade and help maintain that fence. So these are all different things that can be negotiated. And I guess as Alan will probably make a few comments on them as well. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide here. And as part of our cash rental rate survey this year, our special features section for 2023 took a look at who is actually responsible for maintaining that irrigation system. That was one of the questions. Based on the responses that were sent in, about half the time it's the landlord and tenant. A third of the time the tenant takes care of it. The remainder of the time it's either the landlord or someone or something else. On the dual component thing here, I would say the tenant's providing some degree of upkeep. These are probably cases where you're talking about the consumable portions of a pivot, maybe the tires, air the tires up, replace a gearbox, type the fluid off. Bigger upgrades, bigger repairs, things like if a land tenant sees that the pump isn't working underground, that would be an expense that the tenant wouldn't be paying traditionally. The irrigation company come out and pull the pump out. and repair it or replace it. That'd be a landowner expense because that's a permanent improvement that's going to be clearly staying with the property. Another slide we had right here. When it comes to a situation, let's say the tenant is the one providing the pivot on the rented ground from the landlord. Something happened to the landlord's old pivot and the tenant's providing the pivot. As we mentioned, the irrigated rates assume that the land tenant provides the entire irrigation system. If that's the case, the discounted rate, how much do we take off the cash rent to account for the fact the land tenant's providing the pivot? That's some of the rates that we see up here right now. An example, 52% of the time you take off somewhere between $26 to $50 an acre to account for the fact that the land tenant is the one providing the pivot. So be aware of these discounts. Irrigation systems are very expensive improvements. The cost of steel, the cost of labor are all much higher than they've been in the past. As a result, when you go to replace some of these components of the system, they're starting to be reflected in those expenses. Something that might be a little bit more common right here is on the topic of the power unit. So we have an irrigated parcel of ground again. The only difference on this scenario is the land tenant is the one providing the power unit. So as an example, the diesel engine, electric motor, propane or natural gas engine, something of that nature. Under this case, the breakdown we have right here, about a third of the time, the discount per acre is about $1 to $9 an acre, and about a little more than a third of the time, the discount is between 10 to 20, meaning you take off about $1 to $9 an acre if the tenant provides one of these engines here, and about a little over a third of the time you take off 10 to 20. I would say based on our phone calls here at the extension offices, 10 to 15 is a pretty common number. Okay, we're going to have Alan get started here. I'll stay on to move the slides forward for him. But Alan, if you want to go ahead and power up your camera, we'll let you take lead here. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and mute.
Okay, all right, thanks, Jim. So Jim gave you a great background of what's happening with land values and cash rents. Now I'm going to talk about what I view as being the important stuff, and that's communication. At the end of the day, when there's something goes wrong with a lease, about 90% of the time it's because of poor or incomplete communication. Somebody's just not telling somebody what's going on. And so you have this incomplete communication thing going on. So please understand this is the critical part of having a good lease going forward for your asset, for your farm. Please go ahead, Jim. Next slide. Okay, so one thing that can happen this time of year, especially as we get towards Labor Day, is let's get past this week of record heat. Don't try and go do this right now, but wait until it cools off a little bit. Now's a great time to be out. I joke that it's a great time to be out standing in the field. Jim wouldn't use that verbiage in the text here. Jim changed it to be checking out the crop or grazing land. The tenant should be taking the landlord out there if the landlord isn't going out there himself. And if the tenant, I mean, that's given that the landlord lives close enough to get that visit done. It's a good time to get the landlord out there to see how the year went. It's a good time to see what damage the heat this week caused to our crop ground or our pastures. It's a good time to just check out what's going on. Look at what's happening with the weeds. Look at what's happening with diseases or insect pressure. What happened with soil? Did you have a lot of erosion? If it rained like it did up in northeast Nebraska, did you have any soil erosion to take care of with conservation practices? If you're irrigating, does your irrigation equipment work properly? I mean, I drove by a pivot yesterday where something was missing, and there's water shooting out the top of the pivot, probably 15 or 20 feet. Obviously, that pivot needs some maintenance, but it's just so critical right now to get water out there that no one's going to stop the pivot or at this moment. We have to wait about 3 days, and we may stop it. So it's a good time to have all that communication so we know what's going on. Next slide, Jim. All right, so look what's going on with the crop ground. Look what happened. Did you have good stands in the fields? Did you have wet spots? Did you have dry spots? What weed issues or resistance, insect pressure, all those things? What's the maturity of plants? Where are we at? What's happening? Is corn dented? Did it fill right? Did the corn chips fill clear to the end of the ear cob? All those kind of things. On 4-H land, note if you had much grasshopper damage, those condition, height of plants, what was your weed pressure, and then make sure that noxious weeds or the brush is controlled. So make sure that all those things are taken care of when you're having this visit with between landlord and tenant, and already start the discussion of what's going to happen for next year to be different. What I find frustrating is that the only conversation we have with landlord and tenant sometimes is just with the one about renegotiating the lease, and it's mostly talking about money. I think some of this other stuff has to be discussed and figured out too, before you can just talk about money. Go ahead. One thing Jim and I feel very strongly about is if you have a verbal or handshake agreement, it's time to get that ended. You need to go to a written lease. Listen, the verbal handshake agreement is fine for people my age or people my parents' age, the next generation up. They're rapidly leaving us, but that, there's a few of the old people, really old people out here, and then there's us old people, right? So what we have to understand is that we need to get rid of those handshake or verbal agreements. Participants tell me all the time that are my age or older, well, our handshake meant something, our word was our bond. I get that. But we're not doing a written lease for us. We're doing a written lease for the next generation. What if I'm gone tomorrow? Or what if the tenant is gone tomorrow? That sort of thing. I mean, the landlord or tenant either one of us could be gone tomorrow for whatever reason. So just understand that it's for the next generation or the people taking that lease over. That's why you want a written lease, to cover those little nuances of a lease that need to be written down. So to terminate a verbal lease via handshake or verbal lease, you have to do that 6 months prior to March 1st. That's what the Nebraska Supreme Court has ruled or determined. That means that 6 months prior to March 1st, 2024 will be September 1st, 2023. So make sure that they have notification of that. I think at the slides at the end, we cover what that notification should or could look like. Pasture leases are a little bit different than a cropland lease in that most pasture leases in Nebraska, not all, but most, are 5 or 6 month leases, May 1st to October 1st, or June 1st to November 1st, or May 1st to November 1st, 5 or 6 month leases. Because that pasture lease ends, and now we go into 24 and we're restarting a pasture lease, there's no termination notice needed, really. The lease ended. So the tenant would have to re-ask if he wants to rent that pasture again for a new year, and the landlord would have to, or the landlord needs to say, do you want to keep the pasture or not? That sort of thing. So just understand that notice that Jim and I are going to talk about at the end of the slides is not necessarily needed for pasture leases. Okay, Jim. So, a written lease will carry higher overall value than a verbal lease because you have all these little things written down. You have the rights and the specific duties of each party spelled out. That's really important. And we're doing this for the unforeseen passing with older landlords or tenants. So another party can step in and manage the estate, and there's no hiccups. An absentee third party that you may designate as being your heir may not have current knowledge of experience or experience in ag industry. So please understand that we're doing it for all those people. I know that the farm I happen to own, is going to go to my children. And right now, I don't think either one of my children could drive to my farm. They don't know where it's at for sure. They have an idea, but I don't think they could drive right to the property. So that would be trouble for managing it, because if you don't know where it's at, then how are you going to manage it? So that's one thing I need to rectify, but it's also something that I think everybody should consider. Okay, next slide. So as I've talked about, all these real things we've been working on here at the end of the year, towards the end of the cropping year, try and get some of this stuff reviewed. And I don't hesitate to try and review this before harvest begins. There's a little bit in time right now, right? And I've talked to several farmers that say that right after harvest is the busiest time of the year, because you're trying to get the year put to bed, your equipment put to bed, cattle taken care of, all the stuff's going on, machinery put away, cleaned up and put away. There's just too much happening at the end of the year to try to consider that then. So right now there's maybe just a touch of a lull before they start harvesting corn silage, for instance. So look at all these things, like when are you going to set, it's a great time to renegotiate, or we talk about when are we going to have the lease payment made? When are we going to have a termination notice? What does that look like? All these things that could be due in a written lease, like when's it start and when's it end? Now, are we going to have a renegotiation period? Or, all those kind of things. So make sure that you've looked at all those things and know what you have in place for that lease as you go forward. Okay, go ahead. Should a lease be when should a lease be renegotiated? Maybe this is done at the same time every year to avoid confusion and mistrust. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is I've run into situations where if prices are going up, the tenants want to renegotiate right away, but the landlord wants to wait until right before March 1st when the lease starts. If prices are going down, the landlord wants to renegotiate right away, and the tenant wants to wait towards March 1st to renegotiate the actual price. And so I think that what we need to do is specify a time of year where that's going to be done, and both parties have to agree to that and just kind of go forward from there. There's no law or rules or anything like this. I just think it has to be visited about, and we have to do that clean so there's good communication and people know what the other party's thinking. Next slide, Jim. Please, if you need to get a written lease put in place, consider going to aglease101.org website. If you notice in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, it says the document library. Click on that and you pull up the lease. That'll take you to another page and you can pull up the lease that you would like to use, a crop share lease or a cash lease, those kind of things, either for pasture land or for crop ground. And that's a great place to start in terms of getting a written lease in place. What's next, Jim? Here's what that looks like. So on the left side is publications that give general descriptions of how each part of the right side is filled out. You may need to look at the left side to know what that looks like, and you may not need to. And on the right-hand side, then you have the fillable PDF file you can put on your computer. You can actually fill it out on your computer, delete with your computer, and it works pretty slick. And it's all printed out, and it looks nice, and it's very complete. So I think that was all I had in my slide deck. Does that sound right, Jim?
Yeah. So we'll try to tag team this section here first. I think there's 3 questions that have been submitted, and if anyone has any questions in Zoom, there's a Q&A option. If you type any question into there as they're coming in, I will review those, and depending on the type of the question, either I can take it or Alan can. And with the Q&A that has been submitted so far, what we're going to do is I'll review the first one. I think the second 2 kind of have to do with verbal lease questions. And then we'll just go ahead and open it up for anyone that's still on, and we'd be more than happy to answer those. So the first thing, how do we set up a flex lease to account for some of the differences we've seen with higher or lower or anything in between related to grain prices? Well, with a flex lease, the deal behind that is subject to what happens, and there's many different ways to set a flex up. One way to set a flex up is you start with what we call the base cash rent. That's that blue horizontal bar we have right here. This is our starting point, and this is just a made-up scenario, say for dryland cropland or maybe irrigated cropland in the panhandle. From our base scenario, we work within a range. We could go from 250 down to 190. We could do 180 up to 260. It doesn't matter. You need to set a range. You have a ceiling. The ceiling price is the maximum cash rent. That's in green. And then we have our minimum cash rent. That's in yellow. And subject to this example we'll have here, we have a base price that we're working off of. And one way to set up this flex lease is, okay, the price of corn is 1% higher than we had hoped for. If it's 10% higher, we take 10% of our base cash rent, which would be about $22. 22 plus 220 would bring us below the maximum rent. And the same way we could discount the cash rent to account for the fact if we had a falling out in the commodity prices. And this next slide here will hopefully explain this a little bit better. So we have 2 scenarios here. On the left-hand side, we have a scenario where the corn prices head higher. And then on the right-hand side, we have a scenario when the prices head lower. What do we see here? This might be somewhat comparable to where we initially signed our lease in March. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to achieve it. I think some people would be fairly happy with $5.45 relative to a cash price below $5 possibly this fall for corn. In our left-hand side, we have a case where the price of corn, instead of being $5.90, it's actually $6.35. We work through the math on that. The percent increase is about 7.6%. 7.6% at 220 is 17 bucks an acre. Do we pay it? Well, if you remember back to that prior slide, yes, we would because it's below 250. Let's say the prices of corn really went up. Say they went up to $8.50 a bushel. Does that mean our cash rent would be almost 300? No. Under any extreme case, we top out the cash rent at 250. So even if the percent change in the price would push the cash rent up to 265, we stop at the default at 250 because that's where we set it at in this example. And below 190, we set the default at 190 so you don't go below that. And to finish out this example here, on the right-hand side, we have a cash rent where the cash rent's actually going to decline some. It's going to be discounted to reflect that percent change between our initial expectation and what actually happens. And we just happen to use the planting and harvesting time price guarantees with crop insurance. Some people like to come up with their own averages. That's perfectly fine. Just be aware, you don't do an average based off of one day. You got to pick several days. If you're using this one day in the fall and one day in the spring, chances are you picked a day when the prices, if they're really up or down, that could kind of skew things. We want to look at, say, every Friday in March versus every Friday in November or something to that effect, or Monday or Wednesday. It doesn't really matter. Okay, I'm going to think Alan's going to take the lead on this next question here.
Which means I better unmute myself. Okay. So if we have a written lease or a handshake agreement and we need to switch it over to, excuse me, if we have a verbal lease or a handshake agreement and we need to switch it over to a written lease, how do we set up this termination letter? And I think the termination letter is important because it should be actually sent. I wouldn't trust a handshake agreement, especially with somebody that you're not necessarily getting along with very well, because then there's no proof that you had the conversation unless there's witnesses. Now, what you put in a letter, Jim and I can't give you a template, a letter template, and have you use it. Especially Jim can't do this because universities instructed us that they're not in the business of providing legal advice. But here's what you could put in a termination letter: the date of the letter, the address of the physical address of the landlord and the tenant. So that's well described. So we don't think it's somebody else that's named Jim Smith. Legal description of the property. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be good enough to really well known where that's going to be at in a specific county. And then to talk about that we're terminating the lease that was dated March 1st, 2023, and it ends on February 29th, 2024. As of March, as of February 29th, that lease will be terminated. And then removal of personal property. So in some cases, the tenants will have, maybe some grain in a bin, or maybe they'll have a tractor parked there, or maybe they'll have an engine sitting at the motor sitting at the pivot pump, those kind of things, the water pump. So make sure that they remove their personal property by XX date. There's no questions about that. Make sure there's no questions about that. And then if you need to have somebody look that over and see if it's reviewed properly, you have to get it to an attorney, have them help you with that. And then you also send by certified mail so that you pay more for that, but that's okay because you get a note back saying the other person actually received it, or their signature saying they received it. And that's important because if it goes to a court of law, then that's taken care of. So those kind of things I think about when we talk about telling people to set up a written termination letter. Jim? Oh, yeah, the ground's going to be sold. Do you want me to go ahead and do this one?
Yes.
Okay. All right, here we go. So if the ground's going to be sold, if there's a lease in place, guess what? The lease goes with the ground. Doesn't make it, especially if it's a written lease. No, any kind of lease. It goes with the ground. So if I'm going to sell my ground between now and February 29th, but I have a lease that ends on February 29th, do I have to give the current tenant termination notice? Yeah, you better. If you don't give him notice by September 1st, he could go ahead and assume, especially on handshake verbal agreements, he can assume he's got the ground another year, whether the ground's sold or not. So make sure that you understand that if you're planning on selling the ground this winter, you absolutely have to give termination notice so they don't roll over for another year, because the law would take effect, and the determination says they get it for another year if you don't give them termination. So make sure you have that covered. Or if it's a multi-year lease, that's covered. The only time that you get out of having a lease, the tenant wouldn't have the lease on that ground following a sale, is if somebody buys them out of the lease. Either the person selling the property, the person that bought the property would have to buy a tenant out of the lease or get him to go away somehow. So those are things I think about when we think about the question on this slide. Jim, you can add on if you need to.
No, it's regardless of what's going to happen to the ground, it's good common practice, verbal, written, whatever. Always let the other person know what's going to happen to it. It's just common courtesy. If you are going to sell the ground here in 2024, that's fine. A lot of operators right now are starting to start the initial conversation at appreciation meals on, hey, what kind of seed do you need for 24? What kind of fertilizer? All these different things. So that's a good way to handle that. All right, we had one question submitted. I'll go ahead and read this out loud, Alan. All right, so we have a situation. We have a person that has 5 children, and they are the landowner for Nebraska farmland. After I pass on, the 5 kids, they're going to own the property equally. And how should we own this land between 5 kids equally? And how do you handle this if a couple of them want to get out, but the other 3 want to keep owning the ground? So it's kind of the continuity of land ownership we talk about. It's not an easy question to address. I'll let you take the first stab at it, Al, since it's kind of a succession question, and I'll add them where I can.
Yeah, so from what you've written here, it seems to me that your goal is to see the farm stay in the family. But you're telling me then, with what you've written here, that not all 5 children will want to see the farm stay in the family. You think that 1 or 2 will want to get cash on their portion. So you have to think about this from a couple of different ways. Are any of the 5 a farmer? If any of the 5 are farmers, then that's maybe a different deal. But because you have to make sure that their farming operation can continue, and I'm assuming this land would be needed for that. Now, from the way this reads, I don't think that any of them are farming, but 3 of them want to keep the land. So look at your whole financial picture or your whole asset picture. If you've got cash, life insurance policies, house in town, other assets, vehicles, all that sort of thing, you take that cash all that out as you pass away. Would that help alleviate getting the 2 that want their money out of the picture and don't give any of that to the 3 that want to keep the land? Or that's not going to work, that's not going to help, then could you set it up that the 3 could buy the 2 out, and you wouldn't necessarily have to have them all cough up the money right away, but they could cough it up over a period of time. The other thing I think you should look at is that I don't know how much land you've got. You haven't indicated that, but if you'd have enough land, like 5 pieces, where you could assign each of them their own piece, and then they could do what they want to with it. For the people that want to keep their ground, they can keep it. The people that want to have cash, they can sell theirs. And that at your passing, that's an excellent way to handle that scenario, because if somebody chooses to sell their ground, they don't have to pay capital gains on it. And I don't know if this gives you some idea or not, but it's a sticky wicket. And by the way, congratulations for wanting to work on this ahead of time, because working on this ahead of time is the only way that you'll get it taken care of without that family is just completely falling apart and arguing with each other. Jim, you got anything to add?
No, I think, congratulations. Identifying these issues before you're gone is a good thing. What do you want to have happen to it? Because depending on how you answer that question, and based on what Alan said as well, there are different things that can be done by an attorney to set up that land ownership structure in a way that makes sense. Or you can set up things so maybe there's a buyout. The other 3 kids buy out the other 2. Maybe they buy out the other 2 kids at half the market value if you want to get out. Things to disincentivize people from wanting to sell out. There are different ways you can set this up, but if 2 really do not want it and they need the cash for personal matters, while that's tough to it's tough to see things get sold sometimes. it is a good thing to be aware of so you can plan accordingly for the future. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions typed in here. Got a few slides I was going to point out here before more people start jumping off. One thing, I want to thank Ethan Sorensen over at Next Ag Appraisal and Realty. He's based out of Lincoln. And as I said before, he does appraisal, management, and sales, but I know he is an independent appraiser and he seems to be pretty good at staying busy with that type of work. So be sure to reach out to him with any of your appraisal related matters. And we greatly appreciate his support for helping cover some of the costs for putting on today's webinar. And the other thing is, if you've enjoyed some of the information that we published from the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Report, Barbara Sonderlin over at the NU Foundation helps us with maintaining a small endowment there that helps cover the printing and survey costs, printing of the survey and the things like that. And the final piece I wanted to point out is that we still have a handful of in-person meetings this late summer and early fall. Be sure to call those numbers if you want to get in on any of these meetings. I know Weeping Water was a little short on a few people, but if we can get a few more people to register, I think we can make a go at that. And our final meeting to pull everything together is going to be in Omaha at the Douglas Sarpy County Extension Office there in Douglas County. And don't forget, mark your calendar for November 20th. We'll have an update on our farm policy, farm bill outlook, county level cash rents from USDA NAS, kind of closing out the leases and some of the things related to that. And we'll once again have our Q&A. If you have questions, you just send it to me. As I mentioned before, Alan is retired, but he gets some input. We'll see, maybe he'll help us out just one more time, but I think we might have somebody new coming on, so we'll see. But we greatly appreciate him and his knowledge he shared with us today, so be sure to thank him. And yeah, other than that, in the chat here, we have be aware that there are different things where you can find additional information. And I believe when you get off, there might be a little short Q&A survey. If you liked our presentation, we're always looking for feedback. But please check out the Farm Real Estate or Farm Succession page with the Center for Ag Profitability. Alan, did you have anything else to add?
No, if you have, I mean, if somebody wants to get a hold of me, they got my old email address still works, savenlike2@unl.edu. That still works. So then get a hold of me that way too, if you haven't. If you don't, ask Jim and Jim tell you what my email address is. That works.
Yeah. We're not trying to we have Alan working on a small grant helping us finish out with a few things. So we got a few minutes of his time every week, but there are definitely people on board here. Jessica Grosskopf out in the Panhandle, Shannon Sands in North Platte, and we'll be having someone come on board in the Southeast region as well. So with that, unless there's another question that comes in the next minute here, I think we had a pretty good question today. Be sure to take a look at your verbal leases if you'd like to make any adjustments. And please reach out to one of us if you need anything else. But keep an eye on your email, the recording, in addition to the PDF. I see there are 2 slides I failed to update, but we'll take care of those in the final version that gets posted online, in addition to updating them in the online version. So with that, I think we'll just go ahead and dismiss everyone here, and we appreciate their time today. So thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone.